So my name's Shara Ali. I'll be chairing tonight's proceedings. Thanks very much to Lois Davis, Pete Murray and other officers of London Green Party for organising this. Thanks very much for showing up. We'll have up to 8:30. That's just shy of 90 minutes with a great panel. I hope you'll agree. We're going to hear first from Paul Kershaw, who is chair of Unite Workers Housing Branch. Then we'll hear from our very own Green Party councillor, Pete Elliott, who's a councillor in Lambeth, who works heavily in housing issues. And then we'll hear from Stacey-Anne Young, who really does have to live and deal with the pressure of temporary accommodation. We're going to take, just in terms of how we'll run the event, so up to 10 minutes per speaker. We will then take rounds of questions. You can put a proposal for a question in the chat. The chat will be viewable by everybody. I propose that you just preface your question with a letter Q so that we know that's your intention. If you want, you can also asterisk your Q, and I'll take that as a sign that you'd quite like to deliver your question in person. Like to give the opportunity to make it a bit more dynamic. If you don't asterisk your Q, that's a sign that you'd like it to be read out. And we'll take as many questions as we can, with the objective being that our panel will be able to share their insights with us. Before we go to Paul, actually, we'll take Paul first, then Pete, and then Stacey. I've just got a short statement here from one of the other speakers who was on the original lineup. Davida Dawkins, who's known to Stacey. So let me just read this, and it might set a bit of a tone of the evening. So Davida, who's very sorry she can't be with us tonight, writes, "You are all aware and probably desensitized." Sorry, I've got a little background challenge there. Batia, quietly. This seems like the only way of getting a decent connection in this room. You are all aware and probably desensitized to hearing about the root causes and effects of inequality related to the broken social housing system. If you are unaware, we are on fast track to an era of slums that will be publicly justified in the name of the economy and lack of space. The level of social decline and cohesion will reach a level of mass dystopian proportions. Please do not underestimate this. The Corporate and Strategic Risk Report, Q4 2019-20, for Lambeth Council clearly shows the borough is at high risk of complete failure imminently. It puts the entire community to remain in hostile circumstances. Many other councils around the UK will have similar reports, and as a law-abiding citizen, I'm ashamed to put any more faith into the political systems and mismanaged councils that neglect to look after me, my children, or any other citizen. The concept of leadership is already token. You are all in a position to be a catalyst for change, and the recent encouraging refusal to provide for regeneration from the GLA to Lambeth shows standing up to charlatans means we can avoid them killing our communities and destroying our systems. Now over to Paul, your opening address to the floor, please. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me, firstly. And I think it is a really important time to discuss housing in particular, because really the pandemic has accelerated a whole number of issues to do with inequality, but particularly on the question of housing. And we know that that's true in the sense that it's really highlighted your chances of contracting the virus or suffering serious consequences or dying is very, very closely related to the quality of housing that you have. But also I think that has opened up a debate and a shift in public opinion, actually. And there was I think it was actually a cross-party parliamentary investigation on opinions in relation to particularly actually the Caroline Lucas played a role in it, but it highlighted, I think, a significant shift in opinion on housing. It was quite a detailed research project into views, and it showed that on housing, less than 1 in 5 think that the government's housing policy is in any way satisfactory. There was growing support for rent caps and for more investment in social housing, and a really widespread concern about homelessness. I think that's been highlighted by all the publicity around attempts to get people off the street in the crisis. And I think that is, and generally reports of people saying that things are unfair, they want action about fairness. Now, I have to say, that's at a time when, not just in Britain, but the major so-called progressive parties, social democratic parties, the Labour Party, are actually steering in the opposite direction. So I think it's an interesting political scenario, and that's an issue for debate actually within Unite and within the trade unions, that there is a sort of mismatch between the shift of public opinion on a range of issues, but particularly housing, and the direction of policy of the Labour Party and other parties around Europe, really. Now, as a union branch, I am from Unite Union. That's a very big organisation, but my branch organises a few thousand people that work in mainly social housing organisations and other housing agencies, including agencies that work with rough sleepers in London. And we've had through this period a number of straight industrial issues, and I think in the discussion, just talking before this meeting started, a point was made that people are looking to trade unions as a kind of basic protection mechanism. And I think, you know, that as a union and as a branch, we've grown, people have joined, and people become active and become reps, really just to protect themselves. And they can't rely on their employers to do that, unfortunately. And that does include social housing organisations that might have a rather different image. And unfortunately, I get time, I'll try and develop it. I think that's indicative of the change in their nature, that they behave more like corporate organisations. We have also, by the way, been increasing the number of green reps, and we're trying to develop that side of the work. As a branch, we have tried to take up campaigns and a range of issues that connect us with people that live in social housing and homeless people and so on, because in the past it might have been the case that these sort of organisations would have to some extent spoken out for people who are badly housed and so on, but that is much less true now. So I'll just, as an organising principle, I'll just run through some of the issues that we've taken up. Although it's worth saying that actually Unite, I think for a number of years, has had what would be seen as a really radical policy as a union nationally on housing, in favour of really large-scale public investment in housing, of a mass programme of council house building, of rent control and proper security for private tenants and so on. So as a union, for a period that was completely out of line with Labour Party policy, the party it's affiliated to, became less out of line, but now I think you'd have to say is again diverging. And I think that, as I said, that will provoke a discussion. But we've campaigned on issues surrounding the rough sleeping crisis, and what you can say is that the government's intervention in taking people off the streets, it did give an indication of what's possible. A lot of people were taken off the streets, but we're already seeing, and this will, I fear, be an ongoing problem in the crisis, that the side effects of the crisis are to push more people onto the street. Actually, the chain figures show not only is rough sleeping not ended, but it's quite dramatically increased over the summer. And that's at the same time as there's been really huge cuts over the last decade in provision for agencies that work with rough sleepers. And actually, as a union, we're dealing at the moment with a number of proposed redundancy plans in agencies dealing with rough sleepers. So that really does not square with this idea that we're going to end rough sleeping. That's an important issue, which, you know, requires really serious additional funding, and I think there is popular support for such a campaign. But we're also involved in working with tenants who are organising around the issue of fire safety. I'll just make a few points about that, because you know, if there was time, I'd go into all the issues surrounding Grenfell. But you could just say that Grenfell really illustrated the effects of underinvestment and deregulation, and generally undermining public housing provision. But the promises that were made in the wake of Grenfell have been quite startlingly unfulfilled. And in particular, it's become more and more clear that actually there's been inadequate action on the blocks that have identical cladding Grenfell. But also it's become clear that the issue of fire safety is much, much more widespread than that. And it's a bit back to front that a lot of the focus, and we do work with the groups that organise leaseholders and people in shared ownership, a lot of the focus has been on their problems and the fact they can't sell their flats. But really the issue behind that is the huge scale of dangerous buildings. And of course that affects not only people who can't sell their flats, but social tenants as well. And you know, Inside Housing, the trade journal, which isn't given to being to exaggerating particularly, tried to do an estimate of the scale of the problem, and just pretty much gave up and said it will affect millions of people. And it is indicative that the people who the surveys trying to establish whether flats qualify for this EWS1 certificate, the fire safety certificate, are coming back at the moment at about 90% are not safe by remedial action. So that's an enormous problem. And I think I'm raising that because that's a current campaigning issue. And I just want to say that it's a bit wider than just an issue that affects you if you want to sell your property. And what obviously lies behind that is the need for certainly proper regulation, but for big scale investment in housing. Then there's the issue of evictions. I don't want to say too much about that, but clearly the government have brought to an end the so-called eviction ban that existed since the shutdown. And there's various different estimates, but it's quite clear that there'll be a large number of people that threaten eviction. There may be a bit of a delay because the courts will prioritise other, we're told anyway, other cases. But I think that that's you know, a disaster, particularly taken along with redundancies and the wider problems that flow from the crisis. I think that over the next few months, that's going to be an absolutely major issue that requires radical action. And I would say not only extending the eviction ban, but actually the idea of a rent waiver for the period. If you bail out the banks, why can't you bail out the people that live in tenancies? Because if you don't do that, all you're doing is having a permanent weight of debt, of rent debt on people's backs. And there are quite detailed proposals that people like the New Economic Foundation have come forward with about how you would actually deal with that. And the rider that I would add to that is really that a lot of the figures given, which are horrific enough, assume that this will be a problem only within the private rented sector. But actually, in normal times, the social housing sector evicts an awful lot of people. And there's no reason to believe that's going to be different now. They may delay a bit because they're more politically aware, but that makes this a much bigger problem, I think, than even the shelter figures and the like, which are quite commonly put forward. So that's an issue that we've been trying to be active on, because obviously it will be our members that will be asked to process the evictions of people, and that's not something that they really want to be part of. And then the wider thing I want to make is simply, I mean, I think other speakers are likely to talk about questions of regeneration, but there is a absolutely acute need for more social housing, massively more social housing. And particularly because we work for housing associations, and I think it's particularly important to be clear about their role, that increasingly they've become really agents of multinational finance, actually, through the banks and other financial institutions. And actually they may not be profit distributing in their own right, but their role is increasingly be to recycle that capital. Banks and the investors make profits. And actually, you know, they often justify their commercial activities by saying, oh no, but over there, we're very social. But actually, they're responsible for a net loss of social rented housing. And I think that's an enormously important point, considering what their role is. So we try and get involved as a union branch in fighting unequal regeneration plans and trying to offer information and support to those campaigns. But I think there's a wider need, both for, as I say, a mass programme of building social housing, but also actually for questioning how social housing is run. That there's a lack of democratic accountability. It's certainly reflected in the way they treat their workers, but it's absolutely reflected in the rundown of tenant organisations, any kind of mechanisms that existed in the past to reflect the views of tenants and residents has been greatly mined. So I think those are the main things I wanted to flag up. It's a sort of issue you could carry on indefinitely. And I would just develop that finally, that political point that, you know, Unite is obviously a Labour Party affiliated union, but the direction of travel of Labour at the moment is in a very different direction to the sort of policies that Unite has adopted on housing. And at the moment, that's just the beginning of the debate, but it is quite sharp debate within the union. So I think, put it this way, that there's the possibility for, in the coming period, we should at least be open to the possibility of quite significant political realignment. Nothing is fixed, because when you have a major, I mean, we've had a dramatic event, the financial crash, and now that's being rammed home with the effects of the pandemic. And I think we should be confident that there is a mass support regarding decent housing as the right, for radical policies on that. Really, we've got to find a political way through to getting that represented.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks very much. You can contribute your virtual applause, absolutely, and we'll give you an opportunity at the end as well. So over now to Pete, who for many of you, you will be familiar with, and you may have helped him in his campaigns and the Green Party's campaigns in Lambeth in particular. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you very much, Shara, and thank you for coming and helping me on some of my campaigns as well. It's appreciated. I think it's really good to have Paul sort of setting the scene there, because what he's done is basically explained the breadth and the scale of some of the housing problems we've got. So I'm now going to draw it back in, and I'm going to go down the rabbit warren of housing regeneration and try and look at some specifics and explain a bit of the background to some of that. So I'm Pete Elliott. I'm a councillor in the Gypsy Hill ward of Lambeth, and I ended up heavily active in local politics when I discovered that 6 council estates across Lambeth were being demolished. At one of my first Green Party meetings, I was also inspired when I witnessed Scott Ainsley and Jonathan Bartley encouraging the residents of Cressingham Gardens estate to get organised and challenge demolition. After that meeting, we were socialising, and I met John, an 86-year-old man who was wearing a veteran's badge. Like me, he'd served in the military. Unlike me, he had served in the Navy in the South Pacific in the Second World War. He explained to me what it felt like to have the threat of being uprooted after 35 years in the same home, with all of those memories locked into it. I'm a project manager, and I reflected about how a council could possibly move 300 plus households like John's sensitively and without creating huge irreversible issues. And I decided that it just could not be done, and I still believe that. So this evening, I'm going to talk about 2 things in relation to estate regeneration. I'm going to go through the process of estate regeneration, where I'll let you know sort of what I've witnessed on the Central Hill estate, which has been my home for the last 4 years. I'm going to also let you know sort of why I think the regeneration is not the right answer now or possibly ever. So, the process of regeneration. This is important to you because I can guarantee that this is happening in an estate near you. Labour councils have demolished or are planning to demolish around 200 estates across London. And on top of that, there are the Tory and Lib Dem councils who are also destroying homes and communities. As Greens, we need to be able to show empathy for the hundreds of thousands of people caught up in this awful process. Regeneration starts years before any formal announcement, with the running down or deliberate mismanagement of estates. In Lambeth, this was done in part by stopping routine and preventative maintenance, and also by putting spending caps on the values of repairs that could be done. During regeneration, much more money is taken in rents than is being spent on repairs. The stress really starts to kick in for residents when there is the announcement that the estate is to be demolished, and residents are told that they will be consulted on the options for regeneration. The reality is, though, that those decisions have already been made. As far as I am aware, all of Lambeth's estates that were originally earmarked for demolition are still the ones that are slowly progressing through this process. This is also the point that you start to see mental health issues. Long-term elderly residents are affected the hardest. Those who expected their council home of 50 years to be a home for life. I've spoken to many of my neighbours about how this has made them feel, and people have taken different routes to deal with this, from restarting a smoking habit to antidepressants or even more serious outcomes. Then, to pile on the pressure, the psychological warfare on residents really starts. By the council, they are out surveying, leafleting, and they're holding meetings, but the meetings are rarely public meetings because they don't want the community to come together and organise. There is more pressure from the misinformation, the uncertainty, the false promises, the lies, the guilt trip that is laid at the door of those residents who are standing in the way of progress, the daring to want to remain in their homes. Then the gradual awakening to the fact that the council does not want anything other than demolition. The casual put down of any alternative community-based plans that address the council's stated needs, better than the council's own back of the cigarette packet ideas. The council plans that don't stand up to the lightest of scrutiny, but that doesn't matter, as this is ideological, not something that will solve the stated problems. On Central Hill, we had huge support from the Architects for Social Housing, who proposed alternate plans that were well supported by the community, and I do recommend that you check out the report on the Central Hill experience, on their Central Hill experience, and I'll share a link to that later. The consultations can go on for years before the Cabinet decision is formally made, leaving tenants and especially leaseholders in limbo when they can't sell their now blighted homes. The next stage is the formal decision at Cabinet. On Central Hill, one of the local councillors ended up in private eye for lying to the Cabinet Committee. The Cabinet decision can be called in and then potentially taken to judicial review, which, in the case of Cressingham Gardens estate, they successfully challenged the legality of the consultation. Plans presented to Cabinet for Central Hill in March 2017 stated that this would all be completed by 2025. In March this year, the date had been extended to 2035. And in July this year, 4 months on, we were told that the completion date would be 2040. Once the decision has been formalised, then residents can be moved off the estate. The elderly and most vulnerable seem to go first, along with those who have been making a lot of noise, the organisers, and those that challenge the council. For those that remain, the psychological warfare continues, where the council tries to maintain its dominance and control over the residents. Those residents who have been challenging the decisions through this period will have been worn out by the previous years of effort. On Central Hill, it took over 3 years to get the Cabinet decision. On Cressingham Gardens, it was even longer. Residents need support from people on and off the estate to help them through. While some amazing people have become experts in campaigning, housing law, council processes, along with many other skills along the way, they still need support, as this process takes its toll on everyone. On Central Hill Estate, we have now had another 3.5 years since the Cabinet decision, and we still have no master plan. Around a third of the original residents have been moved off the estate, and many of the homes have been filled by residents in temporary accommodation. On Central Hill Estate, we now face our first planning application meeting, possibly as soon as 13th of October. Please can everyone log on to the council's website and put in objections. Again, I'll share a link with this later. This is only for the first phase though, and involves the demolition of one temporary accommodation hostel, which used to be a nurse's home. This piece of work though is a Trojan horse for the rest of the estate's demolition. Out of these first 31 homes, 21 will be offered at council rent, and 10 will be offered as affordable. So there's none for private sale at all. Affordable actually means shared ownership, which means that you'll have to have a £90,000 plus household income. So it's not quite affordable, but across the rest of the regeneration estates and the future for Central Hill, the proportion of council housing being built by Lambeth's 100% council-owned house build company, Homes for Lambeth, will be very different to the first phase. Of the 4,662 homes that are currently planned to be built, only 186 of those will be so-called affordable, and only 1,070 will be at council rent. So that's 23% will be at council rent, leaving 2,786 for private sale. So, other than that, why is regeneration not the answer? So there's some myths and that kind of need a bit debunking, I think. The new homes apparently will be better for the environment. This is true. However, whilst new homes will be more efficient than the post-war estate homes that could be refurbished and retrofitted, still not being built to the highest possible standards. In Lambeth, the council is borrowing hundreds of millions of pounds from the Public Works Loans Board to then hand over to Homes for Lambeth. Our 100% council-owned company are then going to have to hand over a carbon offset tax back to Lambeth Council because the carbon emissions of the new buildings are far from carbon neutral. What is worse though is that the embodied carbon in the demolished buildings and the new buildings materials are not even considered. As Greens in Lambeth, we were proud to have been the first council in London to declare a climate emergency, but so far in Lambeth, this has just been greenwash, especially from Homes for Lambeth. As I mentioned before, regeneration destroys communities. In rare situations, it can help bring people together, and we have seen this to some degree on Cressingham Gardens. Mostly, though, it destroys interdependent communities and the integrated support networks that are inherent in many of the established estates. Residents in their estates are dehumanised. Residents are decanted from their homes like some dirty wine. Homes are described as units, and phrases like sink estates and brownfield sites are used by politicians and the media to further create a negative impression. Crime-free estates are branded as crime hotspots. Crime is not an issue, and if it is, then there are much more effective measures to deal with crime than demolition. Crime only became an issue on Central Hill Estate since Homes for Lambeth started to move people out, and we've had illegal raves that were based around blocks that have been emptied by the council. I've already mentioned some of the damage to mental health which can lead to physical issues. We have also found on Central Hill that there are some significant health and safety issues. Injuries have been caused by uneven walkways and steps and poor lighting. The roof and sewage system have not been maintained, and some residents have had issues with sewage and water leaks, along with damp and mould. The new homes may be healthier, but are they really worth all the intervening pain and detriment to mental and physical health? Surely the council should just maintain what they have as their tenants pay them to do. On the financial side, this is not going to be a money-making exercise for the council. If Homes for Lambeth is running a profit on its estate regeneration by 2040, then I plan to run the Merlin Marathon in 2041, probably then. We have already spent over £100 million on the regeneration of 6 estates, with no buildings demolished and nothing built. Finally, housing delivery. We do have a housing crisis across London, which certainly doesn't need addressing. We will be demolishing more council homes in Lambeth than we will be building. Those in temporary accommodation who have moved onto the estate now have no guarantee that in 20 years, when the Central Hill Estate scheme is supposed to be being delivered, that they will have a council home at the end of it. They are being used like unwilling property guardians, pawns in this big game of property, where the only winners are the private contractors sniffing around the regeneration industry. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope this has helped sort of understand, and I'll be happy to answer any questions on regeneration and maybe some of the wider housing issues as well, which I've been involved in.
Thanks very much, Pete. Pete, would you like to introduce Stacey?
Yeah, fine. So Stacey is an amazing person. I don't know how she has got where she's got to. She's been suffering temporary accommodation in Lambeth for 8 years now, and yeah, I'll let her tell her story. But yeah, she's an amazing person, and I'm so glad that she has stepped in at this last minute to come and talk. This is the first time she's done anything like this, and so thank you very much, Stacey, and I'll hand over to you.
Hello, everyone. As you all know, my name's Stacey Young. Oh God, sorry about that screaming. It's my son, if you hear it.
It's okay, Stacey. They only start when you're on camera. That's the thing. They've got this knack.
Sorry about that. I've lived in temporary accommodation. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. One thing I've not had for the last 11 years is anyone who has generally listened to me regarding the desperate housing condition that I have found myself in. Today, I want to cover 2 areas in my talk this evening. Firstly, I will talk about my situation, how I've been treated in temporary accommodation. This will be difficult for me, especially as I have never spoken in this kind of form before, so please bear with me. To finish off, I will let you know what I think is needed to improve and things for people in my situation. Okay, I've been on the Lambeth Housing Register for the last 11 years. I was moved into my current accommodation 8 years ago. The building I live in with my children is described as a temporary accommodation. 8 years is actually not really temporary, but yeah, it's Lambeth. Since moving in, have seen my 3 children grow up. They are all under 10 years old. And during this time, I have seen my accommodation fall apart around me and become much too small for me and my young family. Also, during this time, the landlord has literally done no repairs, as in no repairs. My experience of dealing with Lambeth Council has been a nightmare. I've lived in temporary accommodation for the past 8 years. I have had so many problems with this property. Few of them are, listen very well, electric, including bare wires, as in live electric wires, where my 3-year-old, the one you just heard screaming, will push his finger in and literally will get electrocuted. That's not nice. I've got insecure doors, windows. I've had people try to break in before. Rain coming in through the rotten window frames, holes in the ceiling, like water leakages. I've got rats, mold, and loads of other stuff I've got here happening. Not very impressed. I've complained to the council. I've sent emails to them, but no one answered back. No one cares about me and my family. This has caused me a lot of stress. I also have an 8-year-old son who suffers from sleepwalking, and with this insecure windows is such a worry. No one at the council appears to have any empathy for residents in temporary accommodation. I've also emailed my MP who contacted the council but then didn't follow up anything. I thank God today I met Elliott, who has done what he can to help me with my housing issues. Okay, now I'll be talking about the changes and stuff that I would like to see and improve for like the Lambeth and residents like myself. So firstly, my treatment has been awful and I would not wish it on any of you. There are around 3,000 households in Lambeth temporary accommodation, which is around 1% of the population. There are also unknown numbers of people staying on sofas of friends and families, and there will be many more suffering in dreadful and experienced rented accommodation, the council policy has been to try to shift people into private rented sector so that they are no longer responsible for them, which is not right. I feel that the housing officers and those in charge need to have more empathy on people, with know that they are doing their jobs, but at the same time they are dealing with human beings as well. People will encounter problems in their life. No one knows what tomorrow will bring. They should put themselves in our shoes and treat people in the same way they would want to be treated if it were their children or parents. Secondly, I feel that when the council placed tenants in temporary accommodation, they should have officers go out to inspect the properties first before tenants move in, to see if everything is in place and safe for tenants, especially for vulnerable people and those with young children. This will make things easier for everyone, including the council, as they will not have the sort of problem out later or find alternative properties. Since senior managers were made aware of the awful situation that I have been living in, I've now been sent to view 3 homes, and all has been shockingly bad and not fit for mine or anyone else's children. Prior to the viewing, I've been threatened that if I refuse, then I may not be offered anything else. However, I cannot move at my own expense to another moldy, rat-infested place, which is what I've been offered. This practice of putting parents in impossible situations like this must stop and standards must raise. Thirdly, I would like all politicians to make time out to visit tenants in their properties when problems has been raised, so that they can fully appreciate the problems that their residents are facing. Politicians need to be available and accountable to those who elect them. They need to be directly answerable to problems their policies cause. If they understood what it's really like, then maybe they would make better decisions. There needs to be regular opportunity to meet the local politicians and housing officers, to keep communication open and to hear the challenges that residents are living with. Many more tenants are suffering in silence and has no one to speak up for them. Fourthly, I feel when someone comes to the council for help, I think the council should explain in more details what their rights are, instead of just offering them a property and pushing them to sign in papers without knowing the fine print. For example, when there is an issue with the property, we don't know who to contact about problems that we are facing. Finally and last, as a temporary resident, I have no rights. I feel that people that are in position of power look at us as if we are trash and that they are better than us. We should all be treated equally because we are all the same, whether it's race, color, or background or ability, we are all the same. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Stacey-Anne. We've got 3 questions in already. I'm going to read them out, and I think we'll go to Pete, and then Paul, and then Stacey-Anne.
Oh, wow.
Oh, would you like to go first, actually, Stacey?
No. Put me on mute. I'll do last. Thank you.
Well, actually, one of these questions you've actually tackled really well, but we're going to mix it up a bit anyway, so you'll get a chance to go first. But we're really the same team here, aren't we? So Inda Picton Howell says, there is a huge divide in wealth between haves, property owners, and have-nots, renters. To close this gap, we would need a huge decrease in house price values. A typical house in Lambeth valued at 1 million would have to decrease to around 150 to 200,000 at most to be truly affordable. But for a political party to advocate this would probably be political suicide. What's the solution? We got another question from Pete Murray, which is relating to COVID. How can increasing numbers of rough sleepers be protected from increasing coronavirus spread this winter? And finally, Lois Davis asks, what are the panelists' top tips on how to challenge councils and make them listen to communities? So, Pete, over to you. You can answer any or all of those.
Wow. Some really tough questions there, but really good, relevant ones. Indar, your first one. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, London has got a very much overinflated housing market. Your specific question about a political party to advocate for this, it could be political suicide, but ultimately we have to make housing affordable. We have to be bold. We have to come out with policies, I think, that are going to benefit real people. I mean, we've just heard, there's talk of the housing ladder, this housing ladder that people have to get on and things like that. For the people that need it, like Stacey-Anne, people that are in temporary accommodation, then the housing ladder is just miles off. This is, what we need to be doing, I think, is reaching out to people in the less well-off communities and getting them to vote for policies that do make sense to them. And I don't think that, I don't think we should worry about being honest about the fact that the London housing market is completely overinflated, and it's being propped up by money. A lot of it's coming from dodgy sources, effectively. We don't know where a lot of the money's coming from. I was at a compulsory purchase hearing in Hackney last year, and the Berkeley homes were being challenged about their compulsory purchase of Woodbury Down, or one of the homes on that, who was threatened to have her home taken away from her. She'd done all of this research about who was buying up the properties on Woodbury Down on phase 1 and 2. She was on phase 3. Phase 1 and 2 had gone all to overseas Southeast Asian investors, and that's traceable. It's something that's completely and fundamentally wrong. I was out running last week with a builder who builds in Essex, and he's saying market's great because people are moving out of London at the moment, so they're buying up homes in Essex. And I said, well, what about central London then? Surely it's going to crash. And he said, no, because people will still keep throwing money at it. So he's quite confident that it's not. We need to stop trying to worry about this housing ladder and sort of maintaining house prices. It's not sustainable at all, in my opinion. And feel free to disagree with me if you want. So how can increasing numbers of rough sleepers be protected from increasing coronavirus spread this winter? It's such a good question. I mean, the councils have proved that, with the right will, we can house people, and they have managed to get people during this coronavirus off the streets effectively. We need to commandeer spaces where there is spaces, and we need to find provision for them, and be bold. And councils need to, not only just for people on the streets, but they need to commandeer and compulsory purchase homes that are sat empty in London, and make those the council homes of the future, in my view. And the last one was, what was the last one? What are the top panelists' top tips on how to challenge councils and make them listen to communities? You've just got to get active, I think. It's about speaking up for them, scrutinising what they're doing. We have, as Greens in Lambeth, we have been digging down into the finances, following the money, and shouting out when we're identifying things that are wrong. But it's also about amplifying voices like Stacey-Anne's and just saying, like, look, you've got a problem here, and really trying to represent them to council officers and their councillors. And I'm so glad to see a couple of people on this call today that I've helped, so that's really nice. So anyway, but yeah, that's me. That's enough talking for me. Let's hand over to someone else to have a little chat.
Thanks, Pete. Paul?
Managed to unmute. I suppose I'd start on the question about rough sleepers, because in a way, one of the positive signs of the lessons from the initial period after lockdown was the quite dramatic measures that were taken to get people off the streets. And what it showed is that after years of research projects, people stroking their chin, this mysterious problem of rough sleeping, you could actually get people off the street. Largely, they did. And that was by commandeering the empty hotels and making them available. So there's not some long mystery. It does need resources put into it. But those resources the hotels are being closed down. Those resources at the moment, as we go into winter, are being taken down. So I think the basic answer is resources, provide somewhere, proper shelter for rough sleepers to sleep. There's some riders that I think I should add. One is there's been effectively people with no recourse to public funds, i.e. Basically people from abroad are excluded from accessing help. And, in particular, that is absolutely scandalous at any time. But with the public health questions raised now, that's clearly insane. And I think that should be a real campaigning priority. I have to say, an issue that we took up very sharply for a period was also the way some of these agencies at one time would have been very clearly managed and led with a social awareness and now led, because unfortunately St Mungo's shared information on EU rough sleepers, EU residents, with the Home Office, and that led to them being forcibly repatriated. And actually it was subsequently, there was a judicial review and that whole process was found to be unlawful, so they were unlawfully repatriated. And we have had assurances from St Mungo's, but basically I wouldn't completely regard those assurances as bankable. And it shows that unfortunately these organisations need to be put under pressure and made accountable, which we tried to do, and our members working in St Mungo's were extremely unhappy about the role that management played. And actually they justified it to us across the negotiating table. They said, well, look, on the one hand, we've got you, and on the other hand, we want to win contracts. And we've got the Daily Mail. So that was the kind of ethical compass, if you like, a bit awry. And just the other point that does relate to a point Stacey made about the private rented sector is that it's move-on accommodation. Now, it wouldn't have been true in the past. Most people who have been resettled off the streets are resettled into private rented accommodation, which is often really substantive physically, and is also inherently secure because it's high rented on limited term tenancies and so on. And that's exactly what you don't want to be moving people into. So I think that as well is an issue, and that highlights the wider need for secure, affordable housing. And that does connect, I suppose, I'll try and be a bit briefer because I'm going on too long, about this question of house prices though. And, I think the headline points really have been made, haven't they? But it's driven by investors globally. And I think this is also the issue that stands behind the regeneration issue and the proposed demolition of huge numbers of estates. It's not that people seriously make an evaluation and think, oh, that's, that we could house people better by demolishing them. It's that there's a wall of money globally looking for a safe return. And, it's partly what came out of the financial crash, quantitative easing, partly that capitalists, if you like, don't invest in production at the moment because that is insecure. And so there's low interest rates or negative interest rates even. So they invest in social housing, and that's an international phenomenon actually, but it changes the nature of social housing. And they regard inner London estates and the land they're on as not so much social housing actually, but an opportunity to make a killing, to change them into much more valuable accommodation. And that just to touch on it, the point's been mentioned about so-called affordable housing. I always think there's a kind of Orwellian world of housing speak. Really, you have to regard affordable housing. You should always read unaffordable housing, because housing that in London, perfectly reasonable figure that you have to be on 90,000 a year to live in. That's not most people's idea of affordable housing, is it? I've actually been in debates with housing association chief executives on this, and they say no, it is, because actually, because of the level of house prices in London, if you're, say, a junior hospital doctor, it's quite hard for you to buy somewhere that's near your hospital. And there is an element of truth in that, but really what that shows is the need to return to mass public house building. And it can seem timeless that, inevitably people want houses that will go up in price. And of course, that's been a particular British thing, in particular since the Thatcher era, on steroids. And for a period, that does work to a degree, because, my generation could actually afford to buy, and the house price goes up. So you think it's the magic money tree. That's getting us rich. But clearly, it can't. That rests on it being cheap, and you buy it, and it carries on going up. Well, that's finite. That's not sustainable, because they get higher and higher, and they're not affordable when you start off. And I suppose that's the one chink. I think the main thing politically is to go for a mass programme council house building. But the chink in the idea that the middle classes won't buy that is that the children of the middle classes need to earn 90,000 a year to get access to so-called affordable housing. I think there's probably something I'm forgetting in this now. Oh, well, how to make councils listen, and the point's been made, campaigns. I just wanted to make a point, just going back to the building social housing. There's obviously an issue about sustainability and carbon neutral housing and so on, and in principle, public housing should be the answer there. That's an important part of the case for public housing. And this is an issue as a brand we want to take up. Savills did a survey of housing associations, and they found, of housing association chief executives, and they found that only 22% said that planning to be carbon neutral was a long-term priority even. Long-term priorities tend to be things you're not really going to do and worry about. And they found that only 7% housing association chief executives saw it as an immediate priority. So public housing is the answer, but it has to be accountable, and you can't just rely on organisations called housing associations to be delivering in that regard. I think on councils, the point's been made about campaigning. There is a wider point, which certainly has been raised within Unite, that successive year after year of council cuts has really driven things to quite an extreme. And Unite, certainly particularly Unite in local government, has the position that it calls on councils to refuse to implement further cuts, and that the union would back them in taking that sort of stand. And I think we probably do need to start a discussion on that. Our members aren't directly employed by councils, but actually services like services for rough sleepers are provided by councils. We're absolutely interlinked. And that all that issue of do councils have enough money is driven to extreme by the current crisis. And I think we do need to come to a point where we say it needs, and the trade unions as a big force need to back this, a campaign to say, no, we absolutely can't take further cuts. We need to reverse cuts.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thank you. Stacey-Anne.
Yep.
Over to you, if you've got any comments on those three questions. Or anything that you've heard the others say.
Come back to me.
Did you want
I think you should come back to me.
On, say, rough sleepers or tips for council?
Okay. Yeah, I'll go with the rough sleepers. Well, I don't really know much about what's really happening in the council, but for me, for the rough sleepers, I generally think that they should have something in place for people that's sleeping on the streets and stuff like that, because most of the time it's people with mental health and stuff like that. So I personally believe that they should actually have spaces for people like this in, like, even if it's just hostel or anything that they can rough up for them just to get them off the street. Because obviously when it gets to winter, it's really, really cold. And nobody don't want to be in the cold in winter time, because I suffer from sickle cell and I can't be in the cold in winter time. So just imagine you, and some people that's out there, we actually don't know what they're going through and what has led them there, but it must be something, the reason why they're there. So for me, I would generally say that the council needs to put something in place, and also with the MPs as well, they should have that think as well, put stuff in place for people that sleep on the road and all these rough sleepers. Generally, that's my thinking really onto that question, and try to get everybody safe, just like how normal people as well is in this situation with the temporary accommodation and stuff. You never know, one of those people that's probably rough sleepers, they probably was in temporary accommodation and they've had to be, and they've got evicted for whatever reason. But it shouldn't be like that, because everybody should actually get the same treatment. Like, because it's bad that you see someone sleeping on the road. Sometimes I walk past them and I'm like, this is not fair. It's only that I don't have the opportunity where I can just go in and say, look, you need to put these people up, because if I did, I would, but I just don't have the opportunity. But I think that they should have places in stuff in place for people like those to get housing and stuff like that. Doesn't matter their situation and stuff. I really think they should have stuff in place for that. That's all.
Great, thanks. We've got time for more questions. Here's one from Tom Killick. Is there increasing support, especially from Labour, for rent controls and or longer term tenancies with more security? Who'd like to answer that? Just raise your hand. Stacey, your mic is on, so would you like to have a go at that?
No. Actually, wait, hold on. Did you say in Labour?
Yeah.
Okay, I might have something to say, just a little, only because I've had a rubbish experience with my Labour MP. Just because of that, I would say I would actually probably answer this, but then someone professional maybe might answer it like it. But I'm just going to say what I've got to say. Okay, basically with my situation that's going on right now, I literally went to my MP that's the Labour, and I didn't get nothing at all done. Like literally, she didn't follow up anything. And I think that was so wrong, because you are supposed to look after us as our MP. You're supposed to go to the extent and do things when we've asked you to. Because the reason why we've come to you is that obviously the main reason you're our last resort. And if we've come to you as a last resort, I think that you should personally pick up this case and take it on board and make sure that you've done it all the way to the end, where that you've come and check, you've come around and see like the problems as well, and raise it with the council and make sure that everything is in place and gets done, and not just sending emails. And it's not just about sending emails, because sometimes you can send emails and a person can ignore it because you don't actually know if they've received it until they've replied. So when you send those emails saying, oh, we're going to do this, we need to see that proof that you are doing this and you are going to do that. It's not just about saying we are going to and we're going to do this. No, it's about the proof, and it's about helping people that really need it, like myself with my children as well, my son that sleepwalk and these insecure windows that I've got. That's really bad. I literally stressed. Look at my face. I'm stressed. I get no sleep. I get little sleep at night because I have to be listening out for my boy, because the windows are insecure. And I thought when I even tell her that, she would have had more empathy in me and stuff like that. Like, that's mainly what I would say. They need to just fix up a little bit more, to be honest with you. Now over to Pete.
Thank you for that, Stacey. I'm brilliant. I mean, I was lucky when I was quite a lot younger, and I was able to live for 7 years in Germany, and I saw the impact there of lower level rents and much more security in the private rental market, which people can plan plan their whole lives out if they want. And that was the whole sort of thinking behind council housing originally. You'd have a tenancy for life and secure tenancy for life, and people are losing that. even in council housing now and social housing. But from a private renter's perspective, it's an absolute nightmare, and I speak as one of those. And it's very disconcerting. And I had a chat with, no, I won't say it, but I did speak to my landlord earlier on today, and the fact that we're on a regeneration estate as well makes it doubly difficult for both of us. So private renters on the regeneration estates have no rights whatsoever, in the same way as temporary accommodation residents on regeneration estates have no rights whatsoever. Davida, who was supposed to be here, she's actually temporary accommodation also on a regeneration block. So this is the sort of levels of stress that people are having to deal with. And it destroys people's lives. And no wonder we're having so many problems with depression. No wonder people aren't getting active and involved in politics and things like that, because they're fighting for a roof over their heads. We've got to provide people with security so that they can actually get on with their lives and not worry and not stress and not get affected, not their mental health. And it's not just the adults, it's the children who it affects as well. And you just see the problems that are created, and we're creating more problems with the next generations who are seeing these troubles and the troubles that their parents are having to deal with, and the insecurity that they're having to fight for. I could go on, the jobs market, and everything else, and the fact that people are in insecure jobs, insecure housing, insecure income, it just adds up to a world of pain that is creating more and more problems for us all. It's not just for those individuals. As a society, we are failing people fundamentally. But Labour, I don't know about Labour. I don't know where they're standing. Who's the leader at the moment? What's his view on it? I don't know. I think Jeremy probably had a better view in the current one, but I don't know. I think most of the grassroots Labour supporters are all for it. They want to see the stability. They genuinely are good people and want to see social justice. But I'm not convinced that their leadership is of the same mindset, which I think is a real shame, because at the root of the party, they could do some wonderful things, but we're not in that position at the moment.
Thanks, Pete. Before we come to you, Paul, we actually had an interesting comment in the chat from Joshua Williams, and I've asked him whether he'd like to put it himself to the floor, because quite insightful suggestion. Joshua, if you're there, would you like to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Shara. Yeah, I think it's to me it seems quite simple, and I think what you want to do, you don't want to, because I think Boris is on this big house building thing. We don't want to do that because it's going to be quite carbon intensive. But the issue is that a lot of both foreign investors and also individuals in the UK use houses as an asset, and it is a very good asset. If you look at house prices compared to, say, the FTSE 100, they've beaten the FTSE 100. So if you're an investor and you want to put your money somewhere safe, you're going to get a good return on it. You've got to use UK property. And as a result of that, there's only a limited supply of houses, and as a result of that, it means that the property house prices have skyrocketed. And if people are looking at it as investments, are willing to pay more than the average punter who's just looking at it as a place to live. So what you want to do is discourage that that behaviour, because that for me is why house prices are so rise, because people are using it. And so I think if you have an annual, and they have it's called ATED, and it was a similar thing where they did it for foreign investors who are holding properties through a company. So they've used it before to tax residential property. So you have that tax, you say, because with an annual tax on land, you say, okay, so your land is worth whatever, and the tax is based on the value of the land, and it's an annual tax. Suddenly that investment doesn't seem as attractive as before as putting it into shares or a pension fund. And as a result, you say, okay, well, I don't want to put all my money into UK property anymore, it's not good. And that will encourage more people to sell it, because I think the issue now, and also with capital gains tax, because that is a tax that you pay when you sell the property, and in a way it's put off, and often because the house prices rise so rapidly, it's not as impactful when you come to sell the property. Do you want to really attack or put a strong disinvest or discourage the actual holding of the property as an investment? So I think yeah, get rid of. I think that's the reason why I said get rid of capital gains tax and have an annual land VAT tax, because politically you couldn't just have a new tax and not take something away. You have to have a bit of give and take. And I see your comment, Rosemary, on land value tax should be on all properties, but I think you don't want to punish people who have just bought their own house and they're suddenly having to pay a new tax. You can't. The whole idea is to have everyone owns a property, and we want to have this whole. I don't want to use quoting a very unfortunate person, Margaret Thatcher, was the whole property owning democracy. We want everyone to be able to have that security, but we don't want to punish them for having that. So I think you can't really do it on all properties because that'd be quite unfair. So you only do it on properties where the landlord has it and he doesn't live there because he's just using it as an asset. He's not using it to live. You want to make property available for everyone to be able to have that security and to live. So that's why I think you'd only do it on property where the owner doesn't live. But I don't think you can do it on property where people live as their house, because I think that kind of defeats the point.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I really miss the live meeting situation, so I think it's good that we at least try and allow a little bit of interaction than me just reading out questions. Before I come to you, Paul, on what was the original question about rent controls and what's Labour's position on that, and you can also comment on anything you've heard from Joshua and others. I'm just going to add this comment as well from comment from Jane Harrison, if I may. Why are foreign investors allowed to buy homes here? Many countries don't let foreign investors buy until they've proved genuine residency. So if you've got a comment on that as well, Paul, over to you.
Well, yeah, I sort of semi-reluctantly put my hand up. What is Labour's position? I don't think we know, actually, bluntly, is the position, but we can talk about the direction of travel. I mean, firstly, I'm glad to say Unite's position has long been in favour of genuine rent control as well. Actually, when people talk about rent control, sometimes briefly Labour flirted with the idea of rent control in the sense of restricting the rate at which your landlord could increase your rent. Well, that might be better than nothing, but it is worth reminding ourselves that up until the end of the 70s, Britain had a position where there was, at least the law was, firstly, that in the private rented sector, you could have secure tenancies, the same legal document that you would have in the council. And secondly, that there was a fair rent system. So actually, if you felt your rent was, you were being overcharged, you could go to a rent tribunal and have it reduced, either because it was just being overcharged, or if the roof was leaking and the landlord hadn't done anything about it, the rent tribunal could dock a portion of the rent. That was in Britain up till, you know, the 70s, and it now seems like a sort of mad, off-the-scale, extreme policy. But really, we do need something along those lines to provide some sort of security for the mass of us, of the population. Now, you might think that Labour would have championed that, but it's very significant that through, you know, after the Thatcher major governments, Labour did nothing to reverse that. It was the Blair period. It started to be raised under Ed Miliband, and bizarrely, when Ed Miliband lost that election, the Chris Leslie, who was briefly the Shadow Chancellor, gave the prime reason why they lost the election was because they weren't seen as business friendly enough, apparently. And the prime example he gave is because they'd spoken about a very limited form of rent control. So apparently all these people that would have voted Labour were not voting Labour because of this very limited rent controls that was proposed. Now, one of the changes that Corbyn did make was to get a fundamental change, really, in housing policy into the programme. But I think it's really clear that Starmer is moving in the opposite direction. He obviously won't present all that at one go, but they certainly moved away from the commitment to support social housing. And they backed off. Corbyn and McDonnell actually had put the position at the beginning of the pandemic that they should supporting the idea of rent cancellation, that rent forgiveness for the period of the pandemic. Within, I think it was within 2 weeks of taking the leadership position, he dropped that. And there's a clear move away from that. And I think that's one example of where the membership of a union like Unite is going to be asking serious questions about, are they being represented? That will have all sorts of, you know, political consequences. So just, there isn't really time to go into this whole question of land, but I agree in the idea of land valuation, and actually that's not just, shouldn't be just on the question on individual homes, because really there's, at the moment, the Tories are trying to push through a change in planning policy which will give even less say for communities and make it even easier for the landowners. But really what lies behind the lack of council house building is absolutely nothing to do with any problems. There are problems actually in the planning system, but that's not the problem. I mean, there's a huge proportion of homes that are given planning permission and never get built. And they're built out really slowly because if you build them too fast, prices go down. And you wouldn't want that, would you? You wouldn't want affordable. So it's all geared to maintaining market values, but particularly land values. And you know, there's really, most of the money that's made in house building is not made in the house. It's made in the various land deals and getting planning permission that take place before that. And you know, big investment trust, pension funds and others have huge investments in strategic land, as they call it, which is really a massive bet that at some point they'll get planning permission, and then their value can multiply more than 100% quite commonly. That's a pretty good way to make money, isn't it? You own land, and because you owned it and it's got planning permission, it rockets up in value. And really that's what you have to understand, that see what's going on behind all the arguments about regeneration. Should we build huge suburbs which then need lots of transport to get to? All those questions. Nobody is thinking about it from the point of view of how do you build sustainable communities. They're thinking of it from the point of view of how you turn capital over and how you make profit. I've forgotten something there. I think that was sort of the main thing.
That's good. Great. Thank you. We've got one more question, and I'm going to read this question from Jenny Chan, and then we'll go into both, you know, your final answer and any other general points you'd like to make in closing. I wonder what percentage of council properties were lost under right to buy, if anybody knows the answer to that, and how well council have been able to replace those properties. Stacey-Anne, I beg your pardon. It's your opportunity to answer that question or make any final points that you want to make, please.
Okay, I've got some summary that I did draft up.
Yeah.
I won't be too long. Okay. What I would like everyone to do after this meeting is basically go and reflect on what is going on within the housing across London. And people are in temporary accommodation for a whole variety of reasons, usually due to things out of their control. Although I would not wish this on anyone, one day it could be any one of you. And believe me, you do not want to be fighting with the whole broken system while you are also trying to stop the water pouring into your home or trying to prevent kids from touching electrics. Like, seriously. Do what you can while you can urgently to influence the politicians and council's officers to help them understand what it is really like to be living in temporary accommodation. Get active and find out what your council policies are, and now they may be this affecting your local residents, and then work to change them. And also be an ear for your neighbours in temporary accommodation. We are not heard at the moment by those in authority, and you can help amplify our voice. Yeah, you can help amplify our voices. Thank you again, once again. I hope nobody didn't take this offensive. I literally had to get this across. Just sometimes you have to be a little bit harsh just to get your points across and what you want people to hear and stuff like that. Nobody takes this offensive, what I just said. It's just sometimes you have to say things that, because when you go away now, it's not about just us, just here, everyone's here listening. You need to reflect on what you've heard and stuff like that, and think what made sense and what didn't make sense, and what you are gonna do after this meeting and stuff like that. And did you achieve anything here? Did you list? Sorry about that. Yes, you can go. Sorry. Yeah. So as I was saying, like, you've got to reflect and all that. But thank you once again, and I really appreciate being in this meeting. I've never been in one with all I people before, but I'm glad I'm here. Thanks to Pete. Thank you. Back to you, Shah.
Thank you, Stacey-Anne, and absolutely brilliant contribution. And others have been commenting on your contribution in the chat. So thank you so much. And I hope you'll find other meetings to contribute your insights. And in terms of being offended, I certainly don't find it offensive to speak truth. Sometimes speak truth to power. You spoke about accountability or lack of accountability in councils, and I think that's what many of us certainly on this call in the Green Party are about. So thanks for that. Can I now go to Pete on closing comments? Anything else you'd like to comment on, like right to buy, for example? How are those properties going to be made up?
So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind words, Stacey, and well done. You've been absolutely awesome tonight. So right to buy, it's an interesting one. So when we started looking at, when I started looking at in detail at the regeneration of the estates, most of the council estates seem to have about 1/3 of their properties that were held by leaseholders and 2/3 that were still council tenants. So I guess that's the rough proportion probably across London. I don't think it's vastly different across all of them. So I think that we've probably lost about 1/3 of council houses to private right to buy. What I would say though is that we have got housing associations though that councils have handed over the last 20 years or so. They've handed vast swathes of land to housing associations, and they've lost a lot of the control over those properties. In Lambeth, it was a big thing because about a year ago, our cabinet member for housing had set up a forum with housing association managers, and I was just thinking, well, surely that should have been there anyway, right from day one when they handed them over. But they basically handed these properties over, let them get on with it. There's a lot less democratic control, vastly less democratic control than anything that the council offers. So yeah, it's a really big issue, and it's a really good question. The other thing on right to buy receipts, what we found in Lambeth as well, and I apologise because I can't remember the exact figures, but it's certainly in the multiple millions over the last 10 years, is that I don't think Lambeth Council have actually used any, I think they've used some right to buy receipts, but it's very, very limited. But a tiny proportion of the right to buy receipts has been used to build more social housing. So this money has been lost. And I asked a question at one of the full council meetings, I think a while back, and it was about, or it was a members' inquiry, I don't know. I've asked a question anyway about, what has this right to buy money been spent on? And because in their financial transactions, so one of the things, sorry, I'm just going a bit round in circles, but one of the things I'm involved with in Lambeth is a thing called the People's Audit. And I totally recommend that you start scrutinising the finances of your respective councils. And what we spotted in that was that there was money that was being paid back to central government, and it was right to buy money. And we're going, well, what's going on here? And so we asked, why is this money getting paid back to central government? Because councils lose the right to buy money after a certain time if they don't spend it. So Lambeth Council, whereas it's got financial issues, big financial issues, and huge debts, it's not even spending the money that it is getting in. The other thing that Lambeth has done is that it's sold off a lot of its short life property to the tune of about £86 million, which again, that's just gone into the general fund. So this is properties that were no one wanted in the 80s, and that they sort of gifted to people. People had looked after them for 40 years, and they've now, the council decided to evict the residents and sell those properties off. And £86 million at least has been generated from those sales. And again, they've done nothing with it. So we've had no gain in social housing. And I don't know if that's typical across London, but certainly Lambeth is not the best when it comes to social housing, in my humble opinion. Thank you so much for giving up your evenings tonight. It's been a pleasure to actually be able to sort of talk about what is my passion. I live on a regeneration estate, and I do want to be able to share what's going on here, because it's so wrong, and we do so need to get out there in the communities and get active and supporting people on the regeneration estates. They need it. We shouldn't be scared to go onto these estates. They're not crime hotbeds. Go onto them, speak to people. Those people need your help in the same way as the temporary accommodation residents need your help to be supported and to understand and empathise with them, the situations that they're in. So go away from tonight having spoken to people, having listened to us, and then just go and support these people that desperately need help, because they're not going to be able to help us or listen to us or respect us if we're not going to listen to them, respect them, and take care of them and nurture them and their children. So get involved, look at what the council's doing, look at their housing decisions in particular and where the money's going. Don't trust anything the councils say on regeneration. Most of it, 90% of it, is spin. It really is. You cannot believe a word that they're saying, in my view. And this is from me actually sort of challenging these things throughout. Lambeth Council has had 3 business plans now. Well, Homes for Lambeth has had 3 business plans. They've set these objectives over the first 2 business plans, and they failed on 90% of those objectives. Okay, so they're not achieving. So anyway, I'll draw it to a close, but thank you so much. Please object to the Central Hill, the first phase of the Central Hill Roman Rise regeneration scheme. I've posted it in the chat, and so please go on there and object to that and share it far and wide. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Pete. Just finally, we'll applaud everybody right at the end. Paul, your opportunity to say a few closing statements.
Well, I mean, firstly, just on the right to buy, I think the points have been covered, and someone put on the chat actually that 46 of 269 homes have gone on their estate. And when this policy was introduced by Thatcher, it was said that there would be replacement, that that people would be given the chance to own their own homes, and then there would be more social housing provided. And actually, that's been repeated every decade since, and it's simply not. There hasn't been any movement in that direction. It's just been a way of moving homes into the private sector, and it really is that, by the way, because you might think this is all these people owning their own homes and the extension of a property owning democracy, but actually a very high proportion of those homes end up in the private rented sector. One of the difficulties of managing social housing estates now is, and it's been mentioned, that really you're managing a whole set of private landlords who it's often very difficult to get in touch with. So it's the whole policy has ended up with a massive boost to landlordism, which actually is much more expensive to the state, because then you get people with huge rents who then have to go and claim varieties of housing benefit, which is far more expensive than building a decent home and letting it to people. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Just to finish, I suppose, to say, I mean, firstly, the Unite Housing Workers branch is really keen to be involved in campaigns, and so you can find us housing workers, or whatever it is for housing workers anyway. Google that, you'll find it. And also we work with a number of campaigns, but particularly closely with an organisation called SHAC, Social Housing Action Campaign, which organises people, tenants and residents of housing associations and housing co-ops, because we reckon that we have a common interest. Generally, when services are cut, jobs are cut, same process. And so that it forms a kind of network, partly to counterbalance the fact that housing associations have cut off their support for resident and tenant consultation. So any of you that are social housing residents in housing associations, get involved in that. Any campaigns, particularly on regeneration schemes, do contact us. And finally, you know, a point about fighting and campaigning, because I thought what you said, Stacey, was great. I wasn't offended. After all, what a trade union in particular should be about is by standing up to and being prepared to say that, speak a bit of reality to employers. And what we're trying to do is do that on a wider scale. And actually, how social housing developed in Britain was not really the result of some think tank coming up with the idea of how do we improve housing conditions. It was a result of struggle, particularly after the First World War, where there was big rent strikes and so on. And we're in a period of really extreme crisis. There'll be all sorts of pressure to be realistic. And really, we've got to resist that pressure and make it fight for housing housing policy that's realistic from the point of view, if you like, of the 99%. And that's why I hope that different campaigns and different political traditions can come together to re-establish that idea, as opposed to the sort of establishment centrist idea that actually tends to exist in all the three big parties. So I hope, in that sense, that this will be the start of a sort of ongoing relationship with each other.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Stacey-Anne. Everybody can open their mics if you want, and a round of applause would be great.